Chez Numana, nous sommes un catalyseur d'écosystèmes technologiques. Avec nos partenaires, nous réunissons les gens qui innovent afin de créer plus de valeur pour l'industrie des technologies et pour tout le Québec.
Chaque jour, nous posons des gestes qui contribuent à faire émerger des solutions. Nous faisons en sorte que ce qui est aujourd'hui une opportunité devienne demain une réalité.
Chez Bell, on investit dans ça. Dans elle.
Moi?
Oui, madame.
Cool.
On investit dans ça aussi. Tout ça. On investit dans tout ce beau monde. Oh, excusez. On investit dans ça. On investit dans lui. Dans elle. Oh, dans lui aussi. Nos investissements pour le mieux ne datent pas d'hier. Et ce n'est qu'un début. Mieux pour tous.
Nous comprenons les défis, les enjeux, puis la réalité des entreprises. Nous sommes des spécialistes pour vous soutenir dans la gestion des ressources humaines et la formation de la main-d'œuvre. On vous donne tous les moyens pour que les retombées en ressources humaines soient au rendez-vous.
Notre créneau, c'est la gestion des ressources humaines. Que ce soit le développement de la main-d'œuvre, l'organisation du travail, la formation, le recrutement et la mobilisation des employés.
Nos services peuvent être accompagnés d'une aide financière pour répondre aux besoins de votre entreprise. Les services de soutien et d'intégration en emploi offrent les programmes de subvention salariale qui permettent de rembourser une partie du salaire de l'employé. Nous soutenons la gestion de la diversité culturelle via différents programmes qui s'adressent autant aux employés qu'aux employeurs.
Nos services, personnalisés et sur mesure, sont adaptés à vos défis et à votre réalité d'affaires. Ce qu'on peut s'attendre lorsqu'on contacte Service Québec, l'écoute, du soutien et de l'accompagnement. Nous allons analyser vos besoins en vous invitant à compléter un outil que nous avons développé, le portrait RH. Ensuite, ensemble, nous allons établir un plan d'intervention. Vous aurez ainsi accès aux subventions et aux ressources pertinentes pour vous aider dans l'atteinte de vos objectifs.
Que ce soit pour générer de la synergie d'équipe, favoriser la collaboration, améliorer la communication ou bonifier la marque employeur, on vous appuie pour que votre entreprise se démarque.
Il est essentiel que les ressources humaines soient au cœur de votre stratégie d'affaires.
Yo soy Hans.
Yo soy Arquímedes.
Yo soy Raúl Torres.
Eu sou Eminota.
Yo soy Alejandro.
Eu sou Charles Darwin.
Yo soy Luis Pasteur.
Yo soy María Virginia.
Yo soy Leonardo da Vinci.
Eu sou Sócrates.
Yo soy Pitágoras.
Yo soy Ford, Henry Ford.
Eu sou Paquia.
Yo soy Nikola Tesla.
Eu sou Josephine Bell.
Yo soy Steve Jobs.
Yo soy Stephen Hawking.
Yo soy Asimov.
Eu sou Ana.
Welcome back to Campus Party Canada. My name is Laura Beeston, and I'm delighted to be back as your co-host today. We have a wonderful day today, full of technology, inspiration, and creativity. Our guests are incredible. Jordan Souls from Rodeo FX will be here. Blockchain hero Don Tapscott will be here. We've got X Prizes Anousheh Ansari. Plus, for those of you who are with me live in the Palais de Congrès in Montreal, Quebec, we've got workshops, a hackathon, game jam, esports, basketball, VR, a job fair. Live it up. For those of you who are joining me online, thank you so much for tuning in. Please send us your questions via Slido. I will definitely be looking for your direct questions to ask all of our wonderful guests today. And make sure that you get the most out of this hybrid experience by participating. Speaking of guests, this morning we are just so lucky to be starting day 2 with John Mad Dog Hall, who is the board chair of Linux Professional Institute and the president of Linux International. He is one of the highest profile advocates for free and open source software. And since 1969, Mr. Hall has been a programmer, systems designer, administrator, product manager, technical marketing manager, educator, author, CEO, and consultant. He's done it all. He's traveled to over 100 countries speaking on the benefits of open software, and we are just so delighted that his travels found him here today at Campus Party Canada. Please join me in welcoming Mr. John Maddock Hall.
Hello, Campuseros! My name is John Mad Dog Hall. I'm the board chair of the Linux Professional Institute and the president of Linux International. My talk today is, if you don't have free software, you don't have IT. I'd like to dedicate this talk today to Alan Turing, considered to be the father of modern-day computer science. He was a cryptologist, which you'll see how that fits in. He's also a war hero. He helped to break the German Enigma code during World War II, and he saved about 14 million lives. Laura gave a good explanation of the stuff, so I'll skip over this slide, except to say that I'm a pragmatist. Although I do believe that free software is the way to go when you're developing or supporting software, I don't spit on people that use Windows and Adobe and other closed source systems. We're first going to start off today to talk about copyright and licenses a bit so you can understand what is free software. Back before the period of about 1976, there was no copyright that could be applied to software. Software was basically looked at as being in the public domain unless you had a contract with the person that you're selling the software to. So your lawyers and their lawyers would sit down and argue for months about the terms of the contract. You'd sign the contract, and then you would have perhaps one copy of the software to run on one system used by one person. But about 1986, games were starting to come out, and people had ROMs with ones and zeros in them, and they would work very hard to produce a game, and then their competitor would buy one copy of it and mass produce it at a much lower cost, and they wouldn't sell any more. So copyright was then applied to the ones and zeros in the ROM, and then later on to the source code that created the ones and zeros. Likewise, patents were starting to be applied to software also. Now, because you had a copyrighted piece of code or a copyrighted product, you needed to have a license to tell people what they could do with it. And so licenses started to come out. And the very famous one is the EULA, the End User License Agreement, that you as a Microsoft user or as an Apple user probably clicked through, never read it, and so you don't really know what you can do with it. However, there were certain people who said, I don't really want to sell the software, I'm going to give it away. Universities, hobbyists, things like that. But because copyright was automatically applied to whatever they did, they needed to have a license that was easy to give out and tell people exactly what they could do with the software they got. And so two universities in particular, University of California, Berkeley, and MIT, created licenses which basically said, if you can read this license in the source code, then you can use this source code for any purpose and do anything you want to with it, as long as you give us credit for producing the base software. And this was followed by many, many, many other types of licenses, which sometimes differed only in the name of the license. And so there were hundreds and thousands of licenses that were proliferating. And this created a problem for the lawyers who were trying to read the licenses and figure out what you were allowed to do with the software. So the term open source was created as a group of licenses that had particular characteristics, and many of these licenses were what we called permissive licenses. And these permissive licenses said basically you could do anything you want with the software as long as you give us credit for it. Now, there was a person named Richard Stallman who created a project called GNU, G-N-U, and he was going to create a complete operating system that all the source code was available to it. So he needed a license for that. He created one called the GPL, which is the General Purpose License, a General Public License, I'm sorry, and a lesser license used in subroutines that could be linked as the lesser GPL. And this license and this software under it came to be known as free software or copyleft, as a play on terms for copyright. Now these licenses required the people developing the software to make their source code changes available to anybody who they distributed the binaries to. And therefore, this was known as a restrictive license because this had certain things that you had to do if you were writing this software and using it. This was also the software was called viral by Microsoft and other vendors because as they tried to touch this software and use it, sometimes they were required to make their software also, the source code also available. And there's much, much more that I could talk about this, but we don't have time in this talk, I'm sorry. You're welcome to go out onto YouTube and look at some other videos which I've done about this. Now, another thing I want to address here, because this talk is really about security and privacy, is this age-old question of what is more secure, open source code or closed source code? People say, hey, closed source code is more secure because you have security through obscurity. You can't see the holes in it, you can't see the problems, you can't see the bugs, therefore it's more secure because you kind of have to guess where they are. And if that was true, then Microsoft would have the most secure source code on the face of the earth, most secure operating system. We know that's not true. so that can't be true. On the other hand, open source people say, hey, many eyes can see the issues, you can see what's wrong with it, and therefore it's going to be more secure. And that's not true either. I can say as an open source advocate, it's just not true, that neither is inherently more secure than the other. But security along these lines is not the issue. The real issue is how fast can you fix the problem when you find out what it is? Mean time to fix. And with open source code, and especially with free software, since you have the source code available, once the fix has been determined, you can apply that to every system you have. No matter how old it is, if the problem exists in that, you can fix it and create your system. Now let's compare that. Let's take a practical example of that. A little while ago, we had something known as Spectre and Meltdown, two bugs that affected almost every system on the face of the earth. It was actually a hardware problem, but the software suffered for it. Now this problem existed in Windows XP. By this time, Microsoft had gone on to later versions of Windows and had dropped support of Windows XP, but there were still hundreds of thousands of people using Windows XP out there, and they were affected by this problem. So Microsoft was forced to create this patch for Windows XP for this specific problem. The thing was, they didn't have to fix any of the other hundreds of security problems that were in the operating system, and they didn't. So the people in the governments that were still using Windows XP and are still using Windows XP today still have these bugs in the system that they can't fix. Now this brings us back to present day, where we have a lot of people using Windows 10 and Windows 11 is coming out. And Windows 11 has some very wonderful security fixes in it. They basically are using a chain of trust. We'll get to that in a moment. And so Microsoft is saying, hey, if you want a really secure system, you should be going to using Windows 11. But the problem is that Windows 11 doesn't work on a lot of older hardware. And so Microsoft says, well, for that older hardware, just replace it and use Windows 11. Well, there's a lot of people in the world that don't have the money to replace all their hardware. So Microsoft, well, that's no real big problem because we'll keep fixing bugs for Windows 10 and we'll keep fixing them until we get tired of it, and then we'll drop support for it and you're stuck with it, just like with Windows XP. And this is why the free software community says that the real solution to migrating from Windows 10 is not going to Windows 11, is to go to Linux. So before we start to get into this, I want to remind everybody that the real security starts at the very bottom of the system, and then we're talking about the hardware, then the software of the operating system and applications, and then what I call Uber solutions, and also with training of people on how to use it. So let's talk about the hardware first. Hardware devices a lot of times have device drivers in them, which have binary code that have binary blobs in them. Little pieces of code that you don't have the source code for, you don't know what that piece of ones and zeros does for you. And all of these are working typically at a privileged right, so that they can go anywhere and do anything inside of the operating system. You don't know what the code is doing in those systems. You don't know how it works. They could have a trapdoor or a bug in that, and you can't fix it because you don't have the source code for it. And after a while, the company that made that device, whether it's a graphics board or a controller of some type, they get tired of updating these binary blobs for the operating system, and so they stop. And you may lose the use of that particular component, which means you lose that particular board or that particular function. Now, these trapdoors and Trojan horses, they're also operating in a privileged mode, and they can be almost any place. Let's take a look at the boot code. For many years, people were using BIOS. You're all familiar with BIOS. And the fact that this new type of boot code, UEFI, is replacing that is actually a good thing, because it's going to give us much more capabilities of doing things as we start to boot the system. One of those things is something known as secure boot. It means that your operating system has to be signed by the people that turned it from source code into ones and zeros, and then that has to, when that operating system boots, it only runs signed code from the different application vendors, so people can't make fake pieces of code, insert that into your system, and have it run on the operating system. The problem with this whole setup is that certificates, which are the signed pieces of code for the operating system, only come from one particular US-based vendor. And this may be fine if you're like me, living in the United States and protected by our laws and our Constitution and things like that. But if you live outside of the United States, and I don't think anybody here lives outside the United States, right? You aren't protected by those laws and the Constitution. So you have to worry about what happens when somebody hides things inside of that code. And I'm not saying that, I love Microsoft, I love my country, but we have certain times we've done some things and spied on some people and stuff like that who lived outside of the United States that were not protected by our Constitution and our laws. And sometimes we even spied on people who were inside the United States and supposedly were protected by our laws. So, if you don't really have this protection, you might think twice about using this certification process. Now, on the other hand, we have open source projects like LibreBoot and CoreBoot, which actually re-implement the boot code and allow you to see every single line of that code. You can build it yourself, you can install it in the hardware, and you can watch as it boots and does what it's supposed to. If you go down a level even below that, you have to take a look at the CPUs itself. Intel and AMD, as an example, are what we call complicated instruction set computers. Every time you execute one line or one instruction in machine code, you're actually executing maybe hundreds or thousands of lines of something called microcode. Now that microcode itself is like a tiny little program, and of course it's operating at the highest permissions. And so you don't know what's happening in that microcode. You think it's doing whatever the company told you it was going to be doing, but it could well be hiding some type of trapdoor Trojan horse that could be set off at any given time. And people say, well, Mad Dog, it would take, a fabrication plant and billions of dollars to do that if, and nobody has that type of money except some of those agencies I previously talked about in the United States who have money out the yin-yang, and they could actually, and have in the past, actually created processors and controllers that had Trojan horses in them. Now, there's a different type of computer system called RISC, Reduced Instruction Set Computer, that every machine language instruction is basically one action that happens during that clock pile. There's no tiny little program stuck inside of that, and you can time those instructions to make sure that they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Or, if it's simple enough, you could actually produce that processor yourself, hire a fabrication plant that you trust, and be able to make that processor in that fabrication plant and watch every step they do. There's a new technology coming out called RISC-V or RISC-V, and that was developed by the University of California, Berkeley. It's an open architecture. You don't have to pay any money to be able to use it. You don't have to pay any per CPU royalties on it. It's a completely open architecture, and there's a large community of people that are working on this that allows you to see how the processor is built, to emulate what the processor is doing, and actually build your own with a contract with the fabrication plant. Now, this is not just a CPU. The GPU, or graphical processing unit, is another example of this. You execute a few instructions, and it's actually executing millions of instructions on multiple data points, and you don't know what it's doing. You don't know what your USB controller is doing. You don't know what your Ethernet controller is doing. You don't know what your SATA controller is doing. God help you if you remember Win modems. Nobody knew what they were doing. And this is a problem. Now, what you could do is take something known as a field programmable gate array. So a transistor, another name for a transistor is a gate. Okay? It takes two transistors, two gates, to make a flip-flop. Two flip-flops make a half adder. Two half adders make a full adder. A series of full adders make a register, a series of registers, and a control unit makes a CPU. So you see that everything goes down to the transistor level. A field programmable gate array is just thousands and thousands and thousands of these transistors that you can program to be in a particular circuit. And then once you've done that, you can tell the field programmable gate array, hey, right now you're a CPU. A few minutes later, I'll reprogram you, you're going to be a GPU. A few minutes later, I'll reprogram you again, you're a controller. And so you can program these in the field, whereas a CPU or GPU is actually set up at the fabrication plant to a fixed design. What you could do is replace your GPU with a field programmable gate array, and you would then be able to know what that GPU is doing at any particular time. What's more is if the company who designed it went out of business, you have all the source code for programming the FPGA, you have the source code for making the device driver for it. You can maintain that until the dogs come home, okay? And at the University of Sao Paulo last year, they created a virtual GPU out of an FPGA that could run all of the OpenGL test suites and codecs that people normally run. Or you could replace the CPU. I mentioned the RISC-V unit already. There's already been people who have actually created a RISC-V GPU, a RISC CPU out of an FPGA and put that into boards, and you can run Linux on them. Now, Linux as an operating system was always a little more secure than some other operating systems. Maybe you remember MS-DOS or the early versions of Windows 3.1. You didn't even have to log into the system. You just turned the system on, there it was. Well, Unix from the day one was already made to be a time-sharing system, so it always had to have more robust file systems, more robust permissions. TCP/IP was first developed upon Unix systems out of Berkeley, and so they had to protect against the internet from a very early age. And I know that Linux and Unix was not the only operating system that did this, but they tended to work together. So in Linux software solutions, we consider encryption to be our friend. A lot of people looked at 9/11 and other terrorist organizations and they say, these people use encryption to pass messages. Well, that may be true. But the problem is that without good encryption, you can't have good authentication. You don't know that the person you're talking to is really that person. And so what you need to do is have really good encryption and use that to authenticate who you're talking to. And every once in a while, we have politicians in the United States who know nothing about this stuff and start making laws trying to outlaw encryption, and I have to write them 4 or 5 page letters, send them overnight mail and say, hey, idiots, stop doing this. And then 2 or 3 days later, they drop their laws. You can use PGP, which is pretty good privacy, or GPG, which is the GNU privacy model, to do encryption. You can see all the source code, you see the source code for the encryption process. Mathematically speaking, that makes it is perfectly fine. You don't even have to worry that just because it's open, it's going to somehow be easier to break. And but what we should be doing is to teach people how to use encryption all the time, because even bad encryption is better than no encryption. If everybody started encrypting their lunch menus, their love letters, and everything, then the various agencies I've talked about that we don't really like that much, but we need them, would have a hard time decrypting everything. They would have to go to a court and get a subpoena to, a search warrant to make you decrypt your stuff. They'd have to have evidence on you first before they started looking at your encrypted messages, and that's what we should be doing. So with that, with using the Linux system, you can encrypt your files, you can encrypt your whole disks, you can encrypt file by file, you can encrypt your email messages. You can have really good security if you want it. Another phase of Linux security is Linux pluggable authentication modules, also known as PAM. This started off back in the Unix days. This allows you to take an application and say, only this user can only be using this application, only at this time, only this particular way. This can be done completely outside of the application without changing any of the source code for the application at all. It's set up in the operating system itself. And this can allow you to have a great deal of privacy and security so that, let's say a person logs into the system. At the time they're logging into the system, that's when the system actually mounts a file system and their files become visible to the entire operating system and the potential of everybody else. When they log out, the file system is demounted and becomes invisible again. There's whole distributions of Linux that are aimed towards security. One of them is called Security Enhanced Linux, SE Linux. It was first developed by the NSA. Oh, Mad Dog, that's the group that you say we should be afraid of. But you know something? Even the NSA needs a secure Linux system. So they helped to design this, and the Linux community helped them implement it, and now Red Hat as a company supports this particular mechanism as a service. A different type of security comes from a mechanism known as AppArmor. This is more of a application by application. It's a little bit like PAM, application by application security, that's supported by systems called like SUSE and Ubuntu Linux, and Debian turns it on by default in Debian 10. The other thing you want to do is if your system is broken into, you'd like to limit the destruction that the person's going to do. One thing you can do is do a change route as they get in to actually push it off and make them think they're in your system, but they're really not. You create what is known as a jail for them, and they sit there and flounder around in your system while you try and find out who they are. We also have containers and virtual machines which help to limit the destruction that happens by putting various applications into virtual machines. KVM, Xen, and VMware are examples of that, and they're all free for Linux systems. You also have lightweight directory access protocol, and Samba can be set up with different file systems in different places. Again, utilizing PAM to help you do that, utilizing AppArmor to help you do that, to help you limit the destruction if people break into your system. Now, there's various distributions of Linux, which are also security oriented. There's an application suite called Whonix, which hides the IP address of your system as you go out across the internet. Nobody sees the IP address of your system, so nobody can take that IP address and try and attack your system with it. So it kind of hides that from you. And this actually works on Windows, Apple, and Linux. So it's a good thing to learn no matter what system you're working on. Qubes OS is a Fedora-based system. Fedora is the public community system that's produced by Red Hat. And it includes Qubix and Whonix in it, which allows you to have more security if you use that particular distribution. We also have systems that have tool-based for actually people who want to try and break into systems. Because if you've never tried to break into your system, maybe your system isn't as secure as you think it is. And there are actually operating systems set up or distributions of Linux set up that have these tools that people use to try and break into systems to see how secure they are. I'll also talk about Uber solutions. No, for my idea, if you want to talk about security, you have to do it from the very beginning. You have to architect your security solution. One of those things is don't put every piece of software with the face of the earth onto your system. Have a minimum amount of software in your system because that gives you a minimum amount of security holes in it. Tailor your system specifically for the job. If you're going to create a wireless router, just have wireless routing software in it. If you're going to have a firewall, just have firewall-oriented software in it. Also, use a different processor than people expect. You know, if you're going to have a router or a firewall, why use an Intel processor? Why not use an ARM processor? Why not use a Motorola processor? And so if people try and pollute your system by putting an application, a binary application, into your system expecting you're going to execute on it, a Motorola application doesn't work an Intel application doesn't work on a Motorola operating system, and So limit showing yourself to the outside. Don't start up services like a web server and stuff like that on systems you want to be secure. Keep all that stuff outside of your wall of security. Use IPv6 address as your friend. You know, IPv4 is based on a 32-bit address, 4 billion, particular sites. That sounds like a lot, but it's really not. IPv6 is 128 bits, and so you have 64 bits for yourself to use. Sometimes it's 48 bits. Hopefully it's 64, which gives you 4 billion times 4 billion addresses to put your system in. If you move your system around and don't put it in an obvious place, That's a lot of places that an attacker has to probe just to find your system. And if you then move your ports around inside of that address space, it's almost impossible for them to hit by accident or by probing a systematic attack the systems you've got. You can also set up what is known as honeypots to trap people in your system, to keep them there until you can call the authorities that they're trying to break in. Here's a multi-factor authentication. Microsoft has announced that in the future, if you want to, you can log into your system without having to use a password. You get this little key or use some other type of what they call multi-factor authentication to plug into your system, and once that's plugged in, any system that has that key plugged in, it assumes it's you. And other types of multi-factor authentication are facial recognition. Well, that has a problem too. You can spoof facial recognition. Fingerprint recognition. A little bit harder to spoof, but you could spoof it. Maybe say send a message to your phone, different type of authentication. But what happens if your phone isn't on you? What happens if your phone is discharged? What happens if your phone is stolen? What happens if your phone is simply lost, broken? Well, you have a problem then. Time authentication, that you can only log into the system on a particular day, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, any other time, you're rejected. These are all forms of authentication. And a lot of the keys that people are buying are closed source keys. You can't see how they're made, you can't see the processor inside, you can't see the programming of it. There is an open source key made by a company called SoloKeys. They give you all the circuit diagrams, they show you all the source code that's working with them. You implement that inside of your system yourself. It's an open source solution, one that I would recommend. We're going to be having a workshop later today on the Freedom Box. This is a little server system that was set up. It's actually software only, but you put it on some type of little single board computer or regular computer system. We'll talk about that in a moment. And this is a place that you keep your most private of data. All the pictures you send to your boyfriend or girlfriend you don't want anybody else to see. Your financial data, stuff like that. You can keep it in your Freedom Box and set it up so it's really hard to break into. Now, this was developed and first founded by a person named Eben Moglen. He's the person who wrote the GPL version 3. He's a lawyer and professor and an advocate at Columbia University in New York. He started about 12 years ago with this program, and 2 years ago they came out with their first version. In the meantime, they've partnered with an SBC maker, a single board computer maker, to make this tiny little box that they call the Freedom Box Pioneer. And we're actually going to have one of those in the workshop later on. Now, this could be used also as a NAS server, and all of this software is included in Debian 10. So if you have Debian 10 running on your laptop, you can set up in a Freedom Box from your laptop. I wouldn't recommend that, but you could. And you can set up a Freedom Box software in lots of different systems. You can also use this as a NAS server to serve up files to your Linux systems, your Windows systems, your Apple systems inside your house. Now here's a big long list of all the Freedom Box functionality that you can set up with the software that becomes part of Freedom Box. You can set up a virtual private network, a VPN. You can set up proxy servers. You can set up Tor servers and all different types of privacy. You can hide your IP addresses as you go out across the net. Lots and lots of different security-oriented software. But you can also set up things like a library of ebooks that you can then share with your friends through passwords with different types of permissions and things like that. So it's really a huge amount of functionality, and it's all managed through a front panel that's relatively easy to use. Ideally, we like mom and pop to be able to do this, but we're not quite there yet. Sometime in the future, we might be, assuming the mom and pop or a systems administrator. But on top of that, you can put things which we call federated systems. Now, some of you may have used Facebook. I'm sure you've heard of it. Other people use other types of, Telegram and WhatsApp and chat servers and stuff like that. But most of these are configured to a central server, which gives them a point of attack. that they can find out your passwords if they break in and other types of information. So a federated system has no central point of control, and you and a group of friends can set up your federated social systems like Diaspora or Mastodon, and GNU Social to do things that you want to do, and there's no central point of control of that, no place for people to get all of your passwords and everything else. Now, besides all the things I've talked about, when you're trying to set up security, you need to think about a firewall, and setting up your firewall with the rules that say packets going in and out, what packets could come in, what packets could go out. That helps to protect the rest of your systems in your home or in your business. You want to set up a demilitarized zone outside of the firewall for things like, Wi-Fi hotspots and stuff like that. Things people can get to that you don't care that they get to. In fact, you want them to be able to use that. But that's outside of your firewall. This is what I talk about when you have an architected security framework. You want to be able to use virtual private networks so that nobody can see inside your network. It's encrypted end to end. And you want to use DNSSEC if you're going to be setting up a DNS server to make sure, or using a real DNS server to make sure that the DNS server you're querying is the DNS server that actually has the right information. Now, all of this has to be used along with training of the users. Hopefully the users don't have to be trained to the teeth, but they need to know, don't put their password on the little sticky pad and glue it to their monitor anymore. Don't do that. Don't use the same password every place. Don't make it so simple, it's crazy. You have to train your users in this, and you have to make them understand that this is important. I'm sure you've all seen some of the problems we've had with ransomware, with people breaking into systems and bringing it down, things like that. So you need to have people trained and know what they're doing, and that's where LPI comes in as a certification organization. We don't do training. We rely on partners to do training, but what we do is create the tests to make sure that the people taking the test at least can say the word security. And therefore, we try and keep the test prices as low as possible. We have 180,000 certified open source professionals in 180 countries around the world. And we can prove that people who are certified people, everything else being equal, that certified people make a higher salary and are more likely to get a job than uncertified people. So that's the end of the advertisement. The prognosis of this is every day the antagonists get worse. 25 years ago, the antagonists were script kiddies who grabbed a script on the web and executed it against 10,000 systems and broke in, then bragged to their friends and got caught by the FBI. But now we're talking about serious people that do ransomware, terrorism, and even entrepreneurs who create software to break into your systems. They don't use it themselves, they sell it to other people. And so the security issue is growing stronger and stronger every day. And people who thought, oh, I don't have to secure my system because nobody cares about me, all of a sudden find out that they're being hit for ransomware. Sometimes it's $5,000, sometimes it's $20,000. It's gauged to how much you actually have. So we're talking about the really serious folks, people like the NSA. Now just pretend for a moment that you don't live in the NSA, or the USA. I know that's hard to believe, because Canada's the USA of the North, right? I know, that's insulting, I'm sorry. But you also may be in Central America. You also may be in South America. I mean, I don't even call myself an American anymore. I'm a citizen of the USA, because I'm sensitive to this. But even if you live in the USA, there's another organization called the KSB, or the KGB, and they are from, of course, the Soviet Union. They call themselves something different now, but they're still the KGB. But what really keeps me awake at night, besides bad beer and bad scotch, is the fact that the Internet of Things is going to make this problem 50 billion times worse, where people creating these little devices and putting them out there, communicating with your servers, communicating with your systems, and the infrastructure that goes behind that is, I know companies that have nightmares, sweat nightmares, about the Internet of Things and what it's going to be bringing. So I'm not paranoid. I'm not paranoid because my conspiracy theories are true, okay? And I'm diabetic, and I'm fat, and I'm old, and I've had 3 heart attacks, so I'm not gonna live very much longer. But you guys are. You're gonna have to worry about all this, right? And so a final word to the CIOs, CEOs, CTOs, and all the Cs in charge of companies. You have to architect your security right now. There's no single magic bullet to this. It's up and down the line. And no system is completely secure. All you can do is secure your systems to the point that you can suffer the consequences if they're broken into, and buy yourself insurance. Here are some references for the people that are really interested in this type of stuff. Go to any of these websites and they will help you with different ideas and things to become a good systems administrator. So with that, I will open it up to questions. I still have 3 minutes left of my talk. That was amazing. I went really fast, I know that. For the people who speak French and have to translate it into English, I apologize. But now we can have questions.
So much, John Hall. Let's give a round of applause and get your questions to me in Slido. Hello, grab a seat wherever you would like.
Okay.
Grab a seat wherever you would like. So, someone says, Mariano says, hello from Brazil. That's the first one. So that's great to see you again at Campus Party.
I have 2 Brazilian godsons.
Oh, really? Oh, wonderful. Okay.
I actually have 2 goddaughters also, but those are the daughters of Linus Torvalds and his wife Tuve.
Wonderful. So, you know, myself, I wanted to ask this question, but we can skip it if it's, been asked too many times. Where your Mad Dog nickname came from, or if...
Too many times.
Too many times? Okay, the moral of the story is you're a Zen guy now, right?
You can actually Google that on the net.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. The first question we have today that's not about Mad Dog is, would asymmetric encryption methods from blockchain potentially change the use of open source software? So that's maybe a good question to kick off with, for real.
Well, I actually know a professor down in Brazil that is using blockchain not only to manage the finances of solar power collection, but also because if the solar panel is removed from the blockchain, you see it immediately. And so he can tell immediately if somebody has tampered with his solar panel. I'm not the greatest expert at blockchain in the world. I've looked at it a little bit and everything, so I really can't talk too much about that.
Okay.
But I will say that I believe that cryptocurrency and blockchain have an amazing future as a utility.
Okay.
Not as something where you invest in and you think it's going to magically go up, okay? But as a utility, as an exchange for money, back and forth, I think it's got a fantastic future.
Okay, great. We have another question here from Charles. What advice would you give a company that's working on Microsoft but wants to increase its security?
Well, I mean, some of the things I talked about here work additionally well with Microsoft, okay? It's not completely broken. But the problem is, again, if you find a problem, if there's a problem found, then you have to wait for Microsoft to fix that problem if it's a problem inside the code itself. Now, I have an example of many years ago, there was something called the Morris worm. And it was attacking Unix systems, and the worm would just bring the Unix system down. It would just crash.
Oh.
And since most people in those days did not have the source code for Unix, they had to wait until the vendor brought out the module. And I was working for DEC. We had a retired system, much like Windows XP is retired. And my company was not going to bring out the bug fix for that. And I knew that there were still hundreds of thousands of people using our system, so I had to blackmail my company into bringing that system out, bringing that change out. And it still took us 3 weeks to do that. So these people were sitting there with their systems crashing for 3 weeks before we gave them the patch. The open source community, once they understood what the problem was, it took them 3 hours to generate the patch. And this is why InfoWeek magazine, for 3 years in a row, gave an award for best service, not to Hewlett Packard or IBM or DEC or any of those companies, but to the free software community.
Yeah.
And after 3 years of doing that, they never had that particular award again because they knew that every year it was going to go to the open source community.
Right. The power of collective intelligence, hey?
Right.
Right on. I have another question here from Flo, who finds the topic of cybersecurity very hard and wonders how paranoid they should be about their data, and more importantly, how paranoid their mothers should be.
Well, this is one reason why I try and tell people to architect their security.
Yeah.
I mean, if all of your data is represented by pictures of cats and your credit card numbers, you know, pictures of cats, hey, show them to everybody. You don't care. Put them on a nice system outside in the DMZ zone. Let people enjoy them, but you don't do that with your, you know. So first, separate your data, realize what you want to protect,
Yeah.
and then try and protect your data on the most secure system you can.
Gotcha. So we're talking to a lot of folks today at Campus Party who are in university or just starting their career. And I'm curious what advice you have for them. And if you were starting your career again, would you do this, go down the same road, or would there be something else in the tech world that you'd explore given what you know now?
Well, first of all, you're talking to somebody who's 71 years old. I started my tech career in 1969. We didn't have computer science back then.
Right.
We only had computer black magic.
Okay.
We were stumbling in the dark. I actually programmed systems that used plug boards, where you would move wires around the plug board to indicate what instruction you were executing at a particular time. And your subroutine was this big square piece of metal that you would slide into the system, and then the system would do whatever you programmed.
Wow.
I can bring it forward a little bit and talk about Linus Torvalds. And Linus has said that if he was starting out today, he probably would not start an operating system because there wouldn't be any need to. Linux is already there. What he might do is look at field programmable gate arrays, programming them, seeing what, you know, and what I've seen is that the stack has been growing up. Because now operating systems, we have a fairly good idea of how they should work and things like that. Now we're looking for solutions.
Okay.
And I've said many times that people don't buy hardware. They don't buy software. Even, you know, they buy solutions to problems. And if what you want to do is play a game, and you could play that game with 2 tin cans with a string in between them, that's what you would buy.
Yeah.
And, you know, so I say to people, look at solutions as a place where you make your money, okay? Buy a solution for somebody, buy a stereo system that is flexible and stuff like that, create a home automation system. So the other places I would look is in IoT, because it's going to be a huge market for that, and AI.
Okay.
Although I'm happy, well, not happy. I really don't want to deal with AI because I read too many books back in the 1960s from Arthur C. Clarke and iRobot and stuff like that.
Okay.
And I kept telling my students back then, I said, look, if you ever create a computer that you can't unplug, you're a fool. You know? Okay. So I think that most people, when they talk about artificial intelligence, they're really not thinking well enough.
Okay.
So I don't like the term AI. I use the term inorganic intelligence.
Okay.
Meaning something that's not made of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen stuff, but you could. And it's made of transistors and silicon and things like that. And since neurons are these tiny little donuts that, you know, you can store something in, and the synapses are the things that hook all these together, and magically the human mind, through an electrochemical reaction, can have intelligence. I don't see why you can't do the same thing with silicon. Given the fact that you had a large enough memory and a fast enough processor, why can't we have an inorganic intelligence in a machine that could do everything that the human mind could do?
Okay, very
And
interesting.
If that's the case, then there's nothing that a human being can think of that an artificially intelligent thing could not.
Definitely some food for thought there.
So CIOs, CEOs, CTOs, you better take care of your people because those machines will overcome you.
Oh, wow. On that note, I'm so sorry that we're out of time. I have like so many more questions now that we went on that path. Where should people find you, follow you? You're going to be around today, is that correct?
I'm going to be around the whole day. We have a workshop from 1 until 5 about how to install the FreedomBox software.
Right on.
I have some t-shirts from previous campus parties that I'm going to be raffling off. And I even have one of the little FreedomBox computers with a 1 terabyte disk drive that will be part of that raffle. So come to the workshop, and I'm going to have 2 of my compatriots from LPI helping out. So that's where you'll find me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, John, for coming to Campus Party Canada. Let's give it up for John Hall. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So our next guest today is passionate about connecting and building communities to create a more inclusive world. He's worked at Microsoft, tech startups, and was head of business development at Local Logic. Today, Naoufel Testoni is the co-founder and CEO of QueerTech. And QueerTech is an organization that aims to queer the tech world. Please join me in welcoming Naoufel to the stage. Nice to see you in real life.
You also. How's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm in a movie.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're
I'm
welcome.
super
Love the
excited.
glasses.
Oh, thanks. I like your pearls.
Thank you.
Nice. Okay, so I'm so excited about this conversation today.
Me too.
And I wanted to just start with a little bit of background about, what really motivated you to start QueerTech? Why did you do it? Why did you see a need for this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I tell a joke today that being a CEO of QueerTech makes me become a full-time homosexual. So I'm gay by day, gay by night, and it goes back to really. So I grew up in Morocco, right? And it's a relatively conservative country.
Yep.
And also, just like it's not easy to be gay there. And so as growing up, it was one of the things that marked me is that you don't see any visibility, right? And have role models. And as I moved to Canada, Canada is a very open country, right? We're very ahead in human rights, but yet you still see that 50% of LGBTQ people are still in the closet at work, right?
50%.
50%. So
That's
one
shocking.
out of 2 people still don't talk about their sexual orientation at work. And there is a lot of reasons which we'll touch base on. But I've been involved in the tech ecosystem for about 10 years. And every time I go to conferences and I will ask, is there any LGBTQ people? We won't see people, right? There was very little of us or none of us present at this event. And that was one of the motivators to really start becoming visible and starting a community group to bring people together so we could be part of the industry and be part of this community.
Great. And so it's about community building and exposure. How big is this community that you've developed?
Yeah, as of yesterday, we are 6,150 people across Canada.
Wow.
We have about a couple thousand in Montreal. I know, no one would believe that there's so many of us in tech in Montreal, but we are here.
We're here. We're here. Great.
Yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned that 50% of students, or sorry, not students, 50% of queer folks are in the closet at work.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, why that is. Is it just a bad match between employee-employer, or why are those folks feeling like they can't show up as themselves?
Absolutely. So there are 2 groups that we'll touch base on. One is we'll talk about students, right?
Okay.
Because this is where the problem starts. STEM students, and a lot of research people have reported that they already when they go into STEM, which we all know inherently is very male-dominated, cisgender, heteronormative, white. A lot of students that go into that careers a lot of times they don't stay in these programs because one, either they don't feel like they belong there,
right,
or they've had issues with discrimination, harassment. There is also issues with people just report that students are burdened by educating their peers, right? If you're a trans person, if you're a non-binary person, if you're a queer person, you always have to feel that need to be educating people. And it's a huge burden that not everyone is willing to take. And so a lot of people leave STEM.
Okay.
And that's how we lose people. Then there are people who like continue and make it through the programs and then they get into tech, right? And now there is also similar issues. So a lot of the people who get into tech, because we talk about barriers getting into tech, but there is also barriers staying in tech, right? And these barriers are also anything from harassment and discrimination that still happens. But a lot of people feel that they can't, they conceal themselves because they don't want to miss out on career opportunities. They don't want to miss out on mentorship opportunities, and they don't really want to have that need to be educating their colleagues. And this is why it's very important for companies to have training programs around LGBTQ issues or diversity issues, racism. This is why companies should have policies in place to allow people not to be burdened by educating other people.
Right, okay. You mentioned companies, and I'd really like to dig in a little further about not only what they should be doing, but also maybe what students and potential employees should be looking for. I think you and I both know that there's a lot of pink washing out in the world. I think it's safe to say. Sometimes it's a little bit of BS. So, do you have any tips for queer folks about how to choose safe spaces where they can thrive?
Yeah, so I think the community now, it's becoming very vocal about companies who are not really doing things beyond just parading in pride, putting their logos, or you'll see June 1st, everyone changed their logo on LinkedIn and it has rainbow colors and tweet one or two things. But I think a lot of companies are now under evaluation, and we're seeing more and more tech companies are more conscious about diversity and creating bringing diverse group into them. Things that they are doing, now it's very popular that every company will have a diversity committee, which, still BS in my opinion, because you ask them, what are you doing? And it's like, well, we have this diversity committee, and that's all it does.
It's not an action.
It's not an action, exactly. Then you have companies who, as they grow, create employee resource groups. Now, I think those have more impacts because employee resource group are people from the community driven by the community, right?
Yeah.
Black people will have a Black resource group. Queer people will have a pride or a rainbow groups. And these groups are really important to create that sense of belonging for people. And then we see a lot of companies that are going beyond that, right? Where they have training programs for their employees, either on different diversity issues, on queer issues, on racism. We see a lot of companies who are instituting policies, right? Zero tolerance to harassment, racism, things like that, that really makes people who are looking for a job and looking to get into these companies feel more safe as they go through that process.
And they know that there are rules that have teeth should they experience some kind of harassment or discrimination. Okay. So red flags to avoid, maybe? We talked about some green flags. What about some red flags if you are in the job market?
Yeah, so, today, everyone who's looking for a job today should feel a bit lucky because it is a job market for employees.
True.
Companies are growing fast and can't even keep their employees in or get new employees. So it is a great market to apply for jobs. And I think this is the first time where I tell everyone, don't settle for a company that is not going to be aligned with your values and what you're looking for. A lot of people, you open, you want to apply for a job, but take a moment to look at really the values and then few questions that will help you through the interview. One, I always ask, what are your diversity initiatives, right? If they just tell me I have a diversity committee, I'm like, BS. Okay, red flags. Like, no, like what
Red
is this
flag.
committee does? Oh, we meet once a quarter. Okay, great. Well, continue meeting. Maybe you're not the right fit for me.
Okay.
Then you have, the next question is like, well, how big, depend how big they are. You'll ask about employee resource group. These are a really great way to tell you if they have an employee resource group, you're gonna have a support system internally, right? A support system in terms of having that sense of belonging. They'll probably have a mentorship program. They'll probably have gatherings, support. So that's a really good way to see what they're doing. The next one also I ask them, are you partnered with other community groups? So a lot of companies are gonna look into being partnered with different organizations like Black Lives Matter or Queer Tech or any others that serve different minority groups. It's a way to show that they are connected to the community, they're doing efforts to support these communities. And I think those actions speak louder than any of the previous one, because that means they're investing in these communities to grow.
For sure. And I also appreciate a company who knows that like maybe they don't have all the answers and there are people external to them who can, they can work with and collaborate with on that. I feel like that shows a little bit of humility.
Absolutely.
In terms of corporations. We already have questions on Slido. If you'll allow me to just break away here.
Yeah.
We have one that says, hello from Brazil.
Oh, wow.
We need more leaders like you. Here in our country, a soccer player is doing the same in soccer, helping players. Oh, it's just actually a comment.
Yeah.
Richardson. Okay, well, I guess, this shows that visibility matters.
Absolutely.
We've got another question actually that just popped up. Do you see an evolution in an employer or a company mindset and culture in terms of diversity and inclusion? Have you seen it evolve since you founded Queer Tech 5 years ago?
5 years ago.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I think even when I go back 5 years ago, most of the companies we worked with was the large companies. It was the Google and the Microsoft and the IBM. People have, they've had employee resource group, they've had investment. I think today, even our partners goes from companies that are still 2 people. I see startups that reach out and they're like 2 co-founders and they're already thinking about their diversity, right? I think this is something that we have not seen before. People, especially in that early stage startup, spent a lot of time focusing on their product, on investing money, surviving. But I think they see it now, part of that survivor is also to look for that diversity early on. I think the second one also is, we talked about these diversity committees. There are, like every startup now has one. I think everyone feels the need that they need to do something about it. A lot of time, they don't know what to do, which is fine. I think this is where create that committee and start brainstorm ideas and then reach out. I mean, either to Queer Tech or other organization that can support you to create that strategy, right? Training people so we're seeing more and more commitment to diversity. I think also we are starting to get away from what is diversity and why it's important. I think the first 3 years of Queer Tech, we've done so many panels on diversity that we start to do panel anti-diversity because it was like, can we stop talking about this and move on to the next stage? And I think now it's like we are starting to see that next evolution where people are putting more efforts to change their job descriptions, to make it more gender neutral, to make it less male focused, So we're seeing a lot of steps that companies are doing. Recruiters also are becoming more trained on how to interview trans and non-binary folks and creating that environment.
Okay, so there's like a general awareness raising that's occurred in the past 5 years. Wonderful. I'd like to talk a little bit now about like the power dynamics in the workforce.
Yes.
I'm curious, about how you were mentioning retention is an issue.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what are some of the ways to not only hold on to, but support employees who are in the workforce, and also, between colleagues, like what is a way for allies to step up and really help to make sure that their queer colleagues are happy and are flourishing and are staying for a long time?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are 2 parts to the question. The first one is like, companies, it's very clear reasons why companies or people are leaving companies, right? We talk about the great resignation or great research or great, reassessment. And this is impacting not only queer communities, but everyone at the workforce. People want career transparency. People want to have a better trajectory to their career. They want to have mentorship. They want to feel supported. These are things that internationally queer communities have always reported that they feel companies they work at lack. They didn't feel supported, and even sometimes when they come out, maybe there is not enough support from the company around educating their colleagues and stuff like that, and also career trajectory. Mentorship always happened that you connect with someone when you work in a very heteronormative white environment. Maybe that the managers and the mentors will pick someone who's like them, that they see themselves in. So a lot of these people were left out, right?
Okay.
And I think now we're talking about, well, pay more attention to everyone in your company and create this program to retain people. The second part is, what can everyone do? So there is two things. Being an ally, I feel, is the status quo. Everyone today is an ally. Everyone is, you can be an ally to women, you can be an ally to black people, you can be an ally to queer, like everyone, and it's just the status quo. What I want to see is more active allies. And active allies is you go a step further than just tolerating or accepting people, just having that gay friend or that black friend or feeling tolerating or open, and being more proactive, right? If you hear a homophobic comments in the office that someone says, you should stand up.
Shut that down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You should do that. And I think it is more powerful that it comes from a peer for these people than someone, again, from the community that's always like, oh, you're exaggerating, oh, it's a joke, and people feel shut down. I think it's powerful when an ally stand up for someone from whatever community and speak. If there are protests happening, go participate in it. If there is supports around different laws, go support these communities, right? Yeah. So do something that a little bit require an effort on your part than just accepting that status quo.
Okay, yeah, so I'm hearing, don't just be bystander, you gotta show up or shut up, basically. Yeah.
Exactly.
We have more questions here, which is great. Someone is asking, are you noticing that companies are opening up top leadership positions to the LGBTQS workers, or is there still kind of like a ceiling that...
There is still a ceiling.
Yeah.
I think there is a desire to change that from a lot of companies, but it's gonna take time to get there because all the senior leaders and people who are on the path to become senior leaders have always been people from communities that have already been served, right? White, male, cisgender, heterosexual. And I think companies are starting to think, you need to create mentorship program, you need to create coaching program, and you need to handpick certain individual from this community group and put them on these tracks for success. You can't just expect people to get there on their own. I think there is gonna have to be a system. I think another thing we're seeing is more and more queer and trans leaders are coming to the front and talking about their experiences, talking about trying to be role models and trying to be visible, right?
Yeah.
And we need that, right? We need to have more queer stories in the media and queer people in tech in the media. You need to have that visibility so you can inspire other people, because your first step to even success is you're gonna need to come out of the closet and be authentic, because that's a huge barrier that people have between being in a company and being comfortable and feeling authentic.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you talked about being in the closet, being a barrier. We have another question that's asking about, the context of coming out at work. I have to maybe read this a couple times to make sure I'm phrasing it right, but in the context we live in now, not coming out of the closet can be more detrimental for mental health, ? So maybe the question is, being closeted, what is the effect on mental health? Yeah.
Absolutely. So in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of research on this. So a lot of people have always believed, well, my work is my professional environment and I have my personal life, and people I work with don't need to know who I sleep with, and maybe people thought that was correct, but we have so much research that show that people who are in the closet at work do suffer from a lot of mental health issues. They suffer from additional stress. Think of the efforts that it takes to always conceal yourself. You always have to think of alternative stories. Now you have to remember the stories that you're telling your colleague. So there is so much burden that you're carrying in that environment. And when you have that, you're also not going to be in the front to want to be performing and being visible in the company, because you're just trying to keep a low profile and survive. And that's not how you succeed.
Totally. Having a double life is exhausting.
It is exhausting.
It's true. I wanted to touch on something that you were talking about just a little bit earlier about, being visible and, trans leaders to the front and LGBTQ leaders to the front. I'm curious if you think there's a fine line between, platforming and making visible these people and tokenism. Like, is that a danger to you that you think, like, how do you walk that line as a company or, even as a queer person? How do you make sure that you're not falling into that trap?
Yeah, absolutely. So one, if you are a startup or a company and you have that one Black person in your team, don't put their photos everywhere. It's just no one wants that.
And everyone
don't put
knows
them
what you're
front
doing
and center
too.
on your webpage, on marketing, on your. People will find out very easily. I think more and more people from marginalized group or visible minorities are all trying to avoid that. No one wants to be that token gay or that token Black person. So I think you can ask people to be part of your strategy to attract other people and represent that community and go and reach out and get more people. But you have to be very careful because you will be called out on it now.
Yeah. And everyone knows what you're doing too.
Yeah.
It's so
well, because you look at the team and you're like, wait, there is that one Black person, and now I see the image everywhere, and it's like
everywhere.
Okay,
look how diverse we are.
Yeah.
I have a question here about how small companies with maybe less resources find tools to commit to diversity.
There are so many tools out there now.
Right?
Absolutely, there is a lot of it. I think what's really important is this a priority for you or not? Because a lot of time people are always like, well, I'm so busy, I have all these things, I have to fundraise. And the reality is everyone is busy, everyone has so many priorities, and do you believe that diversity is going to be a priority for you? And are you looking to hire? Because if you do, you will find resources. There are so many resources. As I mentioned, we have startups that reach out to me and ask about questions. They're like 2 people, and they're like, hey, we're hiring for 2 roles. Can you help us promote this to your community?
Hey.
A great initiative. Like, hey, can you have a look at the job description and give us feedback?
Nice.
Things like that. Just reach out to someone. And it's going to be very rare that someone's going to tell you, no, I don't want. 80% of the time, 90% of the time, people are going to be very happy to support you and help you, but you're going to have to make it a priority.
Okay, so take the first step, look up queer tech. That's a good first step. I have another question here, maybe on the same vein of sort of recommendations, but do you have any queer leaders that we at Campus Party should be looking to as role models or people to follow and watch and listen to?
There are a lot of entrepreneurs who are queer, and there is so many startups. I mean, everyone talk about Lightspeed because
I was about to say,
because that's the first person that comes on the list every time. I think Dax have been used as the token gay for this industry for a long time. But there are a lot of startups people can look at. So there is on QueerTech we promote a lot of the names, so you can find some of the names on there. But SiloFit has a queer founders. They are a gym membership that's on demand. That started a little bit before the pandemic, and it's growing. There is another leader called Polisa who has Enkidu, which is another cool leader in the productivity tool scene.
Cool.
So it's really just it just matters. People need to be visible, but also you need to do a little research.
Yeah, do some research. Great. I'm totally going to switch gears here just a little bit, but you're from Morocco.
Yes.
I love Morocco. You worked in the United States.
Yes.
And you found yourself in Montreal.
Yes.
So what have you noticed about the tech ecosystems or even the queer nightlife or queer life in each of these places? And why is Montreal unique, or is it unique, or like I'd just love to hear your perspective on these different places and why Montreal is maybe a good place to land. You like it?
So really funny, when I went to university in Morocco, and the program that I went to had a joint program with the university in Quebec. And my mom signed me for that program back then, and I hated the idea for doing that extra credit because I was like, I would never move to Quebec. It's so cold in there.
I was about to say, the
winters.
Like
I've never moved there. 10 years later, fast forward all this, I was like, I lived in New York City. It was a really great experience, and moved to Istanbul. It was also great. And then I was looking at the next place, and I was hesitating between Toronto and Montreal. Ooh. And somehow, anyone that I talked to will, with no hesitation, just go Montreal.
Okay.
So I was like, okay, fine. I'm gonna go and visit Montreal and see what the fuss is about the city. And I think I came here for one weekend, and I was like, this is the city I want to move to. I think the queer scene is amazing and big, and the art scene is great. Also, after leaving Microsoft, I really wanted to stay in tech, and Montreal had a really great ecosystem that was really growing back when I joined it.
Nice. Okay, so between Montreal and Toronto, this is always the big,
Montreal.
Yeah.
Montreal for the win. Always.
It's so funny. Everyone always compares them and then leans into Montreal,
Absolutely.
I think. Absolutely. So, way back when you were in Morocco and you were trying to figure out your path, if looking back now, what do you wish someone had sort of, advised you or told you about your career that you could have used?
Oh my God, so many things. So many things. So one of the things I tell, so I'm going to go back to students because when you leave university to your first job, it's the biggest transition that you're going to do to that professional career. And about 54 or 56% of students in Canada go back in the closet also on their first job because one, they either the same reasons that people stay at the job is they don't want to miss on employment opportunities, they don't want to feel discriminated against, they're not sure how to manage their queerness in that professional environment. And I tell you don't have to do that today. If you go in an interview and you feel that you have to conceal yourself, you don't have to work for that company because there is so many companies today that value that diversity, and you should be putting that front and center. Tell your employer, put it in your resume. It's for once, it's gonna start working for you instead of against you.
Great. Okay. I feel like I love this evolution, just put it in the top line of your
put
letter.
I don't know, put glitter on your resume and
loud and proud.
Whatever you want. Put it, whatever makes you visible to that group, I think. Yeah, because people in university are very active in different queer groups and queer initiatives, and a lot of times they just remove them from their resume, right? Because they're not sure. And I say leave it there because I think it becomes being involved in activities at university is a huge plus now for employers. Yeah. And being queer is just a wonderful added value that you can bring in.
Hell yeah, absolutely. I have another question here. Let me read it. It's a long one. Is it a good solution to ask directly to your employees who are minorities how to deal with all of this? Would they feel empowered by this, or would it be ethical to ask LGBTQ and minority employees what you should be doing as an employer?
Yes, I think you can. I think a lot of so there is a fine line between asking people and getting their opinions and also pushing them to be at the front of the issue, right? I think if you ask people, are always willing to help and share their perspective on what you should do, but you need to remember that not everyone wants to fight your battles.
Yeah.
And this is something that goes in general with even women in tech. A lot of startups I work with, if you are the woman, you are becoming the person who represents that company at every woman in tech event. You're sitting on that chair and talking about how tech is inclusive. And somehow women, people of color, queer people have inherited this problem and they have to be in the forefront. Mm-hmm. And it's not true.
Yeah,
I
and
think
pigeonhole.
the majority needs to be at the forefront because that's how we're gonna change it.
Yeah.
If you're white and straight and you can still sit there and talk about diversity and also fight for those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, going back to tokenism, what we were talking about earlier, you want to make sure that you're not siloing people
Absolutely.
into that one spot. Absolutely. Cool. Well, we've got about 2 minutes left. I don't know if anyone actually in the real life room has any questions, or anyone else on Slido wants to put one in here. Everyone's shy in real life.
I know. This is the first event I came
I know.
to since 19 months now, so it's terrifying to be sitting in there and talking in public. We need to get used to it.
I know.
This is like a good warm-up now.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for your generosity and your insights. You gave us lots of tools and resources to use. How should people follow you, stay in touch?
LinkedIn is the best way, but I'm on Twitter, Instagram, I don't know.
Great.
Whatever.
You're visible.
Just put Naufel.
Yeah.
It's not a very common name, so you'll find me
Naufel.
very
Good.
easily.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for
Wonderful.
coming to Campus Party Canada and
you for
all of the
having me.
amazing work you do for the community.
Thank you for having me.
Everyone, let's give them a warm round of applause.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll give you a little nice
Thank you.
meeting in
Yeah.
real life.
You're welcome.
I'll see you again soon. Okay. So, I'm really excited for our next guests. They're from the Information and Communications Technology Council. They're here to talk today about the enormous opportunities that the tech industry has to offer and some avenues that you in the audience might take on your career pathing. So please join me in welcoming in real life, we've got Rob Davidson, who's the Director of Data Science at the ICTC, and Alex Cuddian is Chief Research Officer, joining us virtually from the West Coast, I believe. Hi, Rob.
Hi, good morning, Laura.
How are you?
Good, thank you.
Good, thank you so much for being here.
No worries.
You love Montreal, so are you having a good time so far?
So far, so good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really good.
Great. So, Rob, just right off the top, I'm curious if you could just quickly tell us, what is the Information and Communications Technology Council? What do you do?
Sure. Well, what we do is we do work around. Oh, hi, Lexi.
Hi, Lexi.
We do work on the digital economy, both research and capacity building programs that focus on the digital economy at the intersection of the future of work, the emerging technologies that surround that, and also social impact.
Okay.
And so, Lexi and I are on the research side, and our colleagues on capacity building are also here in a booth. Hi, Vicky. Hi, Jacqueline, are here to talk to the students as well.
Okay, amazing. So maybe right off the jump, I'm curious about some of the misconceptions you find when people are trying to start and find a career, especially in AI. We were talking about. You mentioned when we were talking, there's a bit of a disconnect sometimes between, what people are thinking they're looking for and what actual path they can go down.
Exactly, and most organizations don't expect you to be sort of the rock star AI expert right off the bat. You have to build up to being sort of like a Dr. Bengio, as an example. So really what's important to understand is that AI, the industry itself, is driven by data. And so when you look at sort of where the jobs are, the vast majority of them are more at the sort of the data level. So collecting the data, doing the data engineering to make it ready for the AI and machine learning experts.
Right.
And so there's a lot more opportunities there to start your career. As a matter of fact, the same as at ICTC. So my data team, they usually start as data analysts or data engineers, and they move into data science roles. Okay. So that there is an opportunity to build your career over time through sort of these other avenues.
Okay, great. So you shouldn't just jump in expecting to be a rock star. You should, start with the data and see where it takes you.
Exactly.
Okay, so data and analyzing data and understanding data and preparing it is one thing. I'm curious what other skills you're seeing as being really the next big wave of job making.
Well, absolutely, and AI itself is more than technology.
Right.
And a matter of fact, when you really get down to it, not every organization is going to be building their own AI. For the most part, they're going to be either consciously or unconsciously deploying AI internally. And so they'll be using other people's systems. So you're going to need, particularly when dealing with data about people, you're going to need ethicists. You're going to need social scientists. You're going to need ethnographers. You're going to need lawyers, auditors, insurance people. So that can essentially create the ecosystem that makes this both safe and useful to the various organizations that you're going to be working with. And just so the people that can see the slides, we've done 2 reports recently on AI, one being about maximizing the strengths, which is about industry of AI, and also about what the workforce should look like. And that was one where we collaborated with Microsoft to work on.
Oh, interesting.
So this is not something new to most people participating in the industry, and that even when you're working on building AI, you need domain experts, whatever you're working on, whether it's health or finance, you need those people that can bring the knowledge and the context to the table, as well as the people that can develop these into long-standing and safe products. So it's not just about the technology.
Okay, so it sounds like there is a lot out there and a lot of possibilities for different jobs that you might not think of that might be indirect as well. And so I'm curious, it sounds like, we're talking about a holistic amount of skills and a holistic amount of, knowledge. I'm curious where and how you think students and folks who are listening should go to round out their skill set and be a good candidate for these jobs in the future.
Well, and it's not to identify, again, these are team things as well. So you're going to need to be able to work with people because the unicorns are far and they're not always around.
Yeah.
So some of the things is to balance, first off, your soft and hard skills. It's not just about the technology. Matter of fact, the technology skills typically are being replaced at a much more accelerated rate. So they only last a few years before you have to upskill them.
Right.
So and one of the interesting things, LinkedIn Learning just came out with their learning and development professional study for 2021. And one of the top things they identified, in particularly Western countries, they identified resiliency and adaptability as the most important traits. So working in sort of wherever you can to find experience. And I really enjoyed your discussion yesterday with Eduardo Caducas on social impact and sort of some of the work he's doing. And essentially for students, one of the great ways to introduce themselves is to start working on social impact projects, either on their own or also in like meetup groups.
Okay.
And so Data for Good or AI or Tech for Good are all good opportunities to start building your skill sets, but also learning how to work within a team.
Yeah, and building your network as well.
Exactly.
So important. Speaking of team, Lexi, hi. Can you hear us?
All good, yeah.
Oh, you're here. Hi, how are you doing?
I'm pretty well on this early morning in Vancouver.
Oh, right. So you're calling in from the West Coast. This is a very cool hybrid experience. I want to include you as well in this conversation. And so I'm hoping maybe you can also talk a little bit about the demand for creative technology and the talent therein, and the report that the ICTC conducted. What did you find were the most in-demand and relevant jobs that are coming up in Canada in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, creative tech is such a cool area, and I have a little bit of a special interest in it because although I love research, I always wanted to be an animator. But it's such a really interesting sector that blends kind of technology with the arts. And in our study that we did in BC, and the reason that we centered it in BC is because BC is actually the home of creative tech. It's where the sector really first kicked off. It's where there was the most job growth, and a lot of international companies set up as well as homegrown companies that saw success. And we saw a number of different jobs that were in demand. In this study alone, I think we identified about 60 different jobs across 4 different areas.
Whoa.
But what's really interesting is that ultimately this is all really anchored in this booming growth that we just saw across the digital economy more broadly. For example, if you see, for those that can see the slide that are watching at home or in person there, Overall, we did see that obviously during the pandemic, there were a number of sectors that were negatively impacted. But when we look at the digital economy specifically, it was actually booming. By summer 2021, we are about 12% above pre-pandemic levels in terms of employment. So just tons of opportunity, really.
Okay, great. So if you are a student listening today, where would you go? What would you do if you could? I mean, you seem to love your job, but what would you do, or what would you advise them to do next in their career?
Yeah, I think what's really cool about the growth that we've seen across the digital economy really is that there are so many diverse opportunities. So of course, there's the kind of the traditional, more traditional tech roles, of course, in places like AI, for example, and I think some of them that Rob mentioned. But increasingly, we are seeing other sectors across the economy adopt technology much more. And with that comes new jobs that are in demand. They might have kind of an angle that's related to healthcare or to agriculture, for example. So I think, I wouldn't recommend one area specifically. I think there's just so much opportunity that could really fit the specific experience or sector that somebody's interested in.
Okay, we have our first question on Slido. Someone is asking about the hot and booking sectors in Canada's digital economy. So again, a question of like, where should people be looking for jobs? The hot sectors right now. What do you think?
Well, I'll take a stab at this, and then I don't know if Rob wants to fill in too, but definitely, I mean, one of the areas that I wanted to focus on for this presentation is creative tech, and that is absolutely one of the hot sectors within the digital economy, if you want to look at it that way. In our studies, we do tend to look at what we call these innovation areas. So outside of kind of more traditional tech, what are the areas of the economy that we think are going to see substantial growth, employment demand, et cetera, going forward? And interactive digital media, of which creative tech is part of, is definitely one of those areas. And in fact, it's one of the fastest growing of those innovation areas that we're seeing in Canada. Alone, it will. We've estimated that it will be responsible for over 100,000 jobs by 2025. So definitely tons of opportunity in creative tech.
Okay, for those of you who missed it, we had Mark Petit here yesterday, and he's Unreal Engine and Epic Games. I feel like this is hitting that right on the nose there. By the way, everyone, upload your Slido question. Ooh, I have one that just popped up. How many more digital workers would Canada need in the next 5 years? And do you see there being any opportunities for immigrants who want to come to Canada and join us?
Well, I've gone back to one of the slides here that specifically says that based on our Digital Talent Outlook 2025, we see another 250,000 new jobs into the economy. And we do see it around across the board. Outside of creative tech, other areas where we expect to see significant growth is around green technology.
Right.
In particular around electric vehicles, also in advanced manufacturing. So it's really, you name an industry and there's going to be a technology aspect that will be in a growth mode.
Okay, great. I have a follow-up question to that. I'm curious, as potential employees, have you noticed anything from your research that employers are looking for? Like, what can make you stand out as potentially someone to get hired? I don't know who wants to field that one, but what are employers looking for on your CV and in your experience?
Dive in, Lexi.
Yeah, sure. I'll start with that. I mean, one thing that we're definitely seeing more and more of is kind of the emphasis on, and I'll put this in quotations because I don't think they're soft, is soft skills. So of course you need those kind of hard technical skills specifically related to that occupation, but much more and more, I think employers are really looking at those soft skills, so to speak, sometimes as determining factors in reference to whether someone is employed or not. Another thing that I think is really interesting, especially for kind of the newer entrants into the economy, is really that emphasis on work-integrated learning. In our creative tech study specifically, we did find that employers across the board absolutely felt that overall, those with a work-integrated learning background or some experience applying their skills from university or college or other educational institutions were likely to be more successful in their careers going forward. And increasingly, we also found that employers are looking at work integrated learning as a means of building their pipeline. So converting that student from a will placement to a full-time hire eventually.
Okay, thank you. That's a great answer. I'm curious, you're, coming in from the West Coast and we're in Montreal, and I'm curious about sort of the differences you're seeing in the regions in terms of opportunities or in terms of types of technological jobs. Is Montreal more AI focused? Is BC better for, filmmaking and that kind of thing? I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of diversity across Canada, if there's any insights you can give about the different markets, because it's a huge country, and what people are doing in each region really well. I don't know.
Oh, I'll jump in to start with that. The reason we picked both AI and creative tech as discussion points for today, where Montreal is a recognized global hub of innovation and opportunity for both of those.
Okay.
And so those are two areas that are focused for both the West Coast and for Montreal. So yeah, there's a lot of that, and also looking at what Mad Dog was talking about earlier, security goes through everything.
Right.
And so as Canada moves towards digital adoption across all industries, cybersecurity will be an element of every piece
right,
of that.
Across the board.
Across the board. So also we've talked about ag tech, so you'll see that across Canada as well. Marine and ocean tech in both Atlantic Canada and BC, and then advanced manufacturing and robotics appearing in pockets across, and particularly around the superclusters that the federal government has created.
Okay, so it seems like all over the country, tons of different diverse jobs out there. We have another question actually that just came in about the Toronto-Waterloo corridor. Do you think it's the new Silicon Valley? You both laugh. I don't know. Who
wants to take this one?
I'll take it.
Maybe I'll give that one to you, Rob. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to Lexi's point in particular about work-integrated learning, Waterloo itself as a university is well known for their cooperative program.
Right.
And that's why, for the most part, people will go there for the hard technology, because you also get that component to it. So as far as being sort of a driver of innovation, and also you have sort of the financial sector and a lot of industry based in Toronto as well, that corridor can be an international player. It's on the execution side of the equation.
Okay. Cool. That's a good answer. I have another question here. They're just kind of coming in. I hope it's okay. I'm not leaving them till the end. And
No.
Peppering our talk right here. We were talking about the diverse jobs across the country. One question here from Charles is wondering, where do you think the metaverse is going to fit into this? And what do you think about the metaverse in terms of future jobs? It's a big one.
That's meta, not feta, Lexi.
That's a shame. Well, I mean, I won't necessarily speak to it specifically, but I mean, one thing that we are seeing, which is related, obviously, is kind of, again, with regard to creative tech and more of that blending of sort of art and technology, which also applies, obviously, to extended reality, including AR, VR. And that is one area that we have looked at in this study that we'll continue to look at. Very, very promising. Tons of potential applications. Currently still, I wouldn't say in its infancy, but currently still in that kind of getting to scale up phase. So over the next couple of years, I mean, definitely keep our eyes peeled to see what happens in that area.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I feel like it's just such a hot topic right now, everyone is asking.
Everybody is asking, and there is opportunity, particularly with sort of where remote work will go in the future as far as working from home. And so will the metaverse be one of the places that's used to be more interactive and to sort of build community?
Right.
The question will be, affordability of the technologies as one thing, and particularly accessibility, because we don't want to have a situation where this is, again, just widening the digital divide.
Absolutely. Speaking of work from home, we have a question here actually about the pandemic. Lewis is writing in saying, surely we were not prepared for this pandemic. is there an economic structure that supports the new startups that are coming out of this very strange time? I don't know, Rob, maybe you have some resources that you were...
So, I mean, as far as is there an economic structure for the startups, part of that is, and there is always a challenge in Canada because there is either, true or not, people see the venture capital world in Canada to be extra conservative, so not necessarily supporting. So one of the things that is important to build for is not just to build for the domestic market, but to build for the international markets, in particular with trade agreements like CETA with Europe, the new agreement with the US and Mexico, looking at those sorts of opportunities. And then also looking for the programs, like I mentioned before, the superclusters, seeing if you can associate to one of those. And then also looking for the funding, because there is a lot of money right now, in particular around things like I mentioned, Canadian Digital Adoption Program is a program the federal government is running right now for small to medium-sized businesses to get themselves digitized and to get onto sort of the broader digital economy. So you have to be, though, still pretty careful to look where those opportunities are, both at the federal, provincial, and local level.
Gotcha. Cool. So this is a good segue, perhaps, to talk about some of the resources that you folks have developed for job seekers. So can you talk about a little bit about guiding people to match skills with jobs?
Sure, and one of the things that we've been working on for the past 3 years is for the federal government is the Smart Cities project, and it's about inclusive smart economies.
Okay.
And so we've been monitoring 14 cities over the past 3 years in Canada, one of them being Montreal, to see where the opportunities are. And so one of the tools that we provide is sort of a snapshot of what are the opportunities right now. So as an example on the slide, for those that you can see it, and you can go to the eTalent site that has the URL there, to see this for the various cities. And so this is for a game developer. So in the creative industry that we've been talking about, that it kind of identifies what are the top skills, both that we've identified from job postings, but also we've run surveys with hiring people in the industry to find out what are the most important skills. Not just what are the skills we'd like them to have, but what are the most important skills. So having that ranking, also what the relative wages are for those. So in this case, for an average game developer, $87K, obviously not an entry-level pay, but it is essentially based on our survey data. So we have that sort of information. We also have ICTC has put out a job skill matching tool where you can go in and effectively, for whatever, in this case I have an example for AI, where you can essentially list your technical skills, have it match you to a particular set of jobs and see what your fit is with those.
Nice.
So you can see, oh, not only here are the skills that I have right now that match, but here are where my skill gaps are. And then what we're going to be evolving it to over the next few months is to have local courses suggested and Canadian-based courses that have been validated to help you fill those gaps.
Okay, great.
And we will be also adding, this is mostly on the technical skills right now, we'll be including that soft skill component because we really believe that having that well-rounded individual is what people are actually hiring for.
Absolutely. This is really a great resource. For those who are watching online, you got to go to www.etalentcanada.ca/job skills matching tool, just in case you can't see the slide.
And it is in both French and English.
And it's in both French and English, even better. Rob, I wanted just to quickly touch on something that you said a couple questions ago, but I think it might, affect not only the people who are in Canada, but people who are sort of watching from other countries and maybe wanting to come to Canada and pursue their careers in the creative and digital spaces. I'm curious about the digital divide. Obviously, this is a challenge and something that is going to be keeping us from creating the most inclusive economy possible. So, can you talk to me a little bit about this challenge and perhaps workarounds? Or I know it's a big question, but you mentioned it, and
yes,
I would.
Yeah, And part of it is doing things like Mad Dog was talking about, going open source.
Right.
So that you don't have all this cost on top of things.
Right.
And that you can reduce your hardware footprint. Also, for particularly smaller organizations, leveraging cloud, particularly very secure cloud facilities to build your businesses off of so that you don't have to invest heavily. But then there's the connectivity issues. And that's a bigger challenge, and it needs to be dealt with at a national level, and there are organizations that are working on this right now, but it really is a challenge in the Canadian context because our telecommunications industry is quite tight.
Right.
And so having that sort of competitive nature and without having issues with sort of opening it up too much from a security perspective is really the challenge going forward. And so we really need to focus on the broadband for everyone, to have that as a utility and also a right.
Great. I don't know, Lexi, if you, I see you nodding along, if there's anything else you want to say about sort of facing some of the challenges for Canada having the most inclusive creative tech sector possible.
Yeah, no, I think Rob touched on pretty much all the key points. The only thing I would add is just, although our study focuses on smart cities, we've actually expanded it to look at smart communities more broadly and make sure that ultimately we're not leaving out people that live in more rural or remote communities. And even now, when we're seeing people kind of leaving cities a little bit and looking for, be it more space or more green space in suburbs surrounding those cities. So absolutely, I think the digital divide is a massive, massive issue that needs to be addressed if we do actually eventually want to be able to create a smart and inclusive economy across Canada.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left. I don't know if anybody has any more questions, or people in the audience, don't be shy if you want to raise your hand and yell at the stage. We're here to listen to you. Or I don't know if Lexi or Rob, you have anything else that I maybe forgot to ask you that you'd like to touch on about jobs.
Well,
and
one thing I'll say, and in particular, we mean that AI and creative is anchored here in Montreal. On our AI industry report, we actually collaborated with 2 people from Montreal.
Oh, great.
And Brenda Sescu from McGill as a researcher, and also Phil Dawson from the private sector.
Okay.
So we really do, we do collaborate nationally with people, and in particular in AI. And I'm meeting with 2 people today and later on the very topic of AI. So, and for the creative industry, I think that there's just a lot of growth opportunity here in particular, because it does have a unique Quebec flavor to it as well, that there's a supportive media industry that will help develop new content. And so there will be always a driving factor here, not necessarily reliant necessarily on international entities as well.
Okay. I don't know. Lexi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, the only thing I would add is with regard to the creative sector and Montreal's kind of growing footprint in that space. It was mentioned many times throughout our creative study in BC that Montreal is increasingly becoming a key competitor. And part of that is because of kind of the supportive structures that enable the system or the sector to grow. Whether that's tax incentives, could be kind of new legislation developed about IP development. I think it is overall a pretty supportive ecosystem to really help the sector continue to flourish.
Wonderful. Okay, great. I have another question that just came up. We're talking about all these opportunities. We're talking about different provinces. What's the best way, or maybe the easiest way, to start your career? Just to go all the way back to the beginning, like how can someone who's not in get in?
That is the big question. One of the things, though, is if you're still in university, the work integrated learning. So look for those internships, those co-op programs, because that way, organization, you're not just a faceless resume that comes through the door. They've actually worked with you, or somebody else has worked with you and can recommend you. So having that aspect is critical. If you can't do that, then looking for contract opportunities. We haven't even had a chance. We do research on the gig economy as well. But there are opportunities where you can get in. And in particular in the creative industry, most of it is around contracts that are for a particular property.
Right.
So that they do, people rotate through that industry through different companies frequently. So looking for those opportunities where maybe it isn't, maybe it's just a 3-month stint. Look at it as an opportunity to get your foot in the door.
Yeah. Lexi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, definitely just on the work integrated learning aspect. I mean, there are numerous organizations, ICTC being one, that focus on this quite a lot. So there's a lot of resources for young people looking to get that first experience in the industry. And I would absolutely encourage them to look at those opportunities. Another thing that I think is kind of interesting, which maybe I've seen more and more, especially during the pandemic, is kind of networking. So just even reaching out to people on LinkedIn and asking for a coffee to learn about, how they've progressed in their career, how they've gotten to where they are. I've had quite a few people do this with me in the last couple of months, and I definitely remember those people. Might not necessarily have a job at that time, but if I do, they do come to mind. So I do think kind of just being proactive and building your network is also an important factor here.
Okay, networking. Good tip. Good tip. I'm curious, you mentioned the gig economy, and we've talked about the amount of jobs that are sort of on the way. Best case scenario, like, what is your vision of Canada's sector in the next few years? Like, what do you see ahead of us on this road that excites you? What are some of the challenges that you see as well? Just to close up, like, where are we going? And what's your vision for, like, the best case scenario for Canada?
I'll throw in one challenge, Laura, and that is that we get stuck in sort of traditional university think, which may not keep pace with what the industry needs.
Okay.
And so a lot of people will be looking externally to private sector firms, colleges that have more nimble programming, even in sort of the micro-credentialing space, where if people start to recognize that these programs that are short-term can actually get people to the next stage of their careers, that's going to be sort of a balance that we're going to have to come to, because there is sort of that academic freedom side for sort of tenured professors versus what does the market really demand right now, and how do you mix those so that we can create successful programs.
Okay, so maybe universities listening need to think about getting nimble as well.
And they are. There are a number of cases where they are, and including, as we mentioned before, Waterloo and McGill and other universities that are really trying to make the effort to figure out how to best match that.
Okay, great. And for you, Lexi, on the West Coast, what are you seeing? If you have a crystal ball, what's coming for us from over there?
Well, I unfortunately don't have one of those, but one thing that I do think is exciting is actually, and this might sound weird, but it's potentially being wrong about our forecasts. And what I mean by that is actually we had a reporter reach out to us recently about a previous forecast that we did, saying, hey, well, how did we measure up with your estimate for 2021? And we estimated that the digital economy would employ about 2 million people, and it currently employs 2.2. So I hope that our estimates are conservative, and we'll see even more growth than we've predicted.
Wonderful.
Great point.
Well, we're down to our last few seconds of time here. Do you have any parting words for the crowd and the Campus Party community?
This is a great time to be in and around technology.
Yeah.
And that really, though, to not go just for technology's sake solutions, but looking at what are the social impacts of these things and how does this affect the broader ecosystem. And that goes across both dealing with information about people, but also the economy and sort of climate and ecology. How all those things work together are going to really define whether we're successful or not.
Great. And anything last words, Lexi?
I think Rob pretty much covered it all. The only thing that I would add is ultimately that, yes, it's a great time to be in technology, but also that there's so many avenues for people to get into the digital economy now. As we are seeing, it's really spreading across all sectors and really requiring people from a number of different educational or disciplinary backgrounds. So I think it's a great time from that perspective as well.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for coming for this amazing hybrid experience. This is such a cool talk. I guess this is, par for the course starting now, but it's very cool to have you both here with us. And let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you. This was so cool.
Elbow. Yeah, there we go.
Great. So, that was very cool. I'm feeling very positive about, the job prospects for Canada. I'm so excited to introduce this next guest. He's the Vice President of Development and Technology at Rodeo FX, which is a huge company. You may have seen this name around. They recently received a bunch of Emmy nominations for their work on Falcon, Winter Soldier, Lovecraft Country, and of course, WandaVision. As VP, Jordan Souls, our guest, works in business development and oversees all technological aspects of the company, from IT to infrastructure to software and pipeline design to production and people management. Please join me in welcoming Jordan to the stage. Thanks, Jordan.
Hello, everybody. Jordan. I work for a company called Rodeo FX, as you just heard. So I think the first thing to give you a bit of a breakdown is who am I? So basically, I moved here a little over 10 years ago from Los Angeles. I was working at a company called Sony ImageWorks. I worked on a wide variety of films when I was there. My background is as a software engineer, and so moving into movies was really just because I really enjoyed movies, and that was part of my passion. I ended up working on a lot of CG animated films like Polar Express, Surf's Up, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. Interspersed with my CG and animated films, I worked on live action films like Watchmen or even Spider-Man 2. So the fact that I ended up sort of working or moving to Montreal, but ending up working on superhero films is really not, I guess, a huge stretch, given everything that I was doing before. Here's a little bit about Rodeo. That's a little bit of what we do. I can say that every frame that you saw on there, it was based on an idea or a concept that a director had or a writer put on a page, and then that needed to get translated by our artists at our studio. And a lot of the films that you see there, our artists are very, very passionate about. And it's a really interesting industry, the visual effects industry, because it is a true blend of both art and technology. And they both kind of have to work together. And in addition to all of that, art and technology, you also have a very important people concept, because you're basically dealing with a director, and you're trying to basically pull the ideas out of a director's head in terms of what it is that they actually want to be able to put it on the screen. It's a very tricky and very incredibly wonderful industry to be able to work in, because it's just incredibly gratifying to see at the end the results, and to know that that result came from a lot of discussions, a lot of artwork, and a lot of testing and failing and succeeding to be able to get the final image on the screen. So what do we do for a living? In general, like I said, we generally work with directors, and the directors really just sort of, their job is to tell you what they want. And if their desire is to go to the moon, our responsibility is not to tell them that they can't do it, but to try and figure out how to actually do it. We will have to bring, our job is to help bring your imagination to life. And that's sort of basically the context with which we try to inspire all of the people at Rodeo. And by the way, I say that in a very broad sense, because it's easy to tell that to an artist who is working on a film, but we also have to be able to tell it to people like our accountants, our IT and systems people that end up supporting all of the people that create the imagery, because it's really important that they understand the passion behind it, because sometimes a lot of what we do may not make a lot of sense to everybody, but it's sort of towards the greater good of what the director's vision is. So the idea for us is that we try to innovate with a purpose. So we don't just sit down and try and broadly think about ideas that might be needed in the future. At least at Rodeo, what we like to look at is the script. We like to see what's written down. We like to get an idea of what the director's thinking. And then we like to build tools specific to the project. Every time we try and build something that's very generalized, we end up breaking, or we end up building something that nobody really wanted, or doesn't have a very specific purpose. Most recently, for example, we ended up helping Quebec filmmaker Denis Villeneuve on Dune. And every idea or image he had with respect to how that world was created was very, very specific. And we wouldn't be able to have been able to create any of the worlds or do any of the work on the film had we not been able to really understand or deeply understand what it was that he was working on. And then the tools that end up helping to support him in being able to realize the vision that he had, it's just as vital. So we innovate with a purpose. So let's get right into it. WandaVision. So WandaVision was, it ended up being the very first Marvel Disney Plus TV show. And for us, we took it on because the ideas were, we were really interested. We were looking for a really creative challenge. And the challenges that WandaVision presented were really interesting. So just to sort of try and describe broadly what the idea of, what the conceit of the TV show is, we're following two Marvel characters, Wanda Maximoff, who ends up being the Scarlet Witch, and Vision. And what the director and showrunner wanted to do was they wanted to do it as a bit of an homage to TV. So every episode is reflective of a different decade in television history. So the very first episode is from 1950s. And a lot of the work that's done in the episodes are very, very deliberate, i.e., a lot of the research that we had to do was literally just watching TV from each of these decades and really understand. So this was the first episode, and a lot of it was on A Dream of Jeannie and Bewitched, the Dick Van Dyke Show. We then moved on to episode 2, which basically moved into the 1960s. So on this one, we were looking at episodes like Bewitched, and a lot of what we begin to start looking at too is the composition of the TV shows at the time. Not only the physical idea. Like, it's very obvious here that we're staring at black and white, but the 1960s is when the black and white begins to start moving towards color. We then move into episode 3, which is the 1970s. So now we're definitely dealing with color, but a very washed color, very kind of yellowy color. But again, also, it's almost difficult to imagine, but we were also dealing with square TVs all of this time and giant cathode ray tubes. So this was not really the most clear visuals we've ever seen. We then move into the 1980s. So this was very much about Full House, Family Ties, a lot of the sitcoms from the 80s. And the other thing to note too is that the way that the style of how how sitcoms were filmed in each of the decades was also played a very important role in terms of the composition of the show. Finally, we moved into the 90s, so this was more Malcolm in the Middle, Gilmore Girls. Again, the 90s was the time that we begin to start seeing the introduction of HD, so you'll begin to start seeing a 16:9 aspect ratio, a wider aspect ratio, as we moved away from the square TVs. We then moved into episode 7, which is based on The Office, Modern Family. Basically, sitcoms that resulted in these types of testimonials, where basically it was trying to kind of be a documentary, mockumentary type of world where we're always interviewing people. Again, we're now moving into fully HD realized life. So what we were asked to build, and again, that's literally what the entire show was about. It was basically trying to tell a story by using sitcoms as sort of the vehicle, and then being able to push the story through all of these decades. So what we were working on was something almost completely beside the point. It was and how it was described to us in quite literally an email was, we would like you guys to work on The Hex. And we were like, what is The Hex? And it was the sitcom world of WandaVision takes place in a small town. The Hex is kind of the spell that basically sits over top of the town. It's basically a manifestation of Wanda's energy. And I gotta say, after we got that email, no one had any idea what was actually, what we needed to do. That was, again, text on a page with no real understanding of what it is that we wanted to do. But again, it sounded cool. It was in a world that we were interested in, so we wanted to sort of explore it. So here's the actual script as it was presented to us. She sticks her hand in further and is suddenly pulled inside of the energy field. So that's what we get. What we end up producing is this.
What is it?
Some sort of energy field.
Be careful, Rambo. Captain Rambo. Watch it.
The Hex. The way to get there, though, is incredibly complicated, which we'll get into. Here's another line in it. Cut to a shot of the Welcome to Westview. Strange shimmer appears. Geraldine's thrown backwards, lands in the grass. Cars drive up beside her. Once again, what we're presented with, and then what we have to end up creating.
Where's Geraldine?
Oh, she left, honey. She had to rush home.
One last example. Wanda disappears through the energy field, and Monica gapes up as a patch of red growing upward until the entire barrier ripples with a scarlet glow. Here, once again, it is.
Is this yours?
missile was just a precaution. You can hardly blame us, Wanda.
Oh, I think I can. This will be your only warning. Stay out of my home.
Stand down!
Wanda!
Stand down!
So super cool stuff. And basically a lot of, as we began to read the script, we began to realize that this, what we initially thought was just would be some simple effect, actually ended up being a character in the film. A manifestation, as we read in the very first email, of not only Wanda's energy, but also her emotion. And so what we also learned as we started reading through the scripts is that actually the field begins very translucent. You almost can hardly see it. And then we end up at the very end where it's incredibly visible. And of course, she's just incredibly upset. And so you see that as a reflection of her emotion. And so we begin in terms of trying to figure out how or what this is. So the takeaways that we always had from the very beginning was this is very much based on TV. The story needs to be told through these sitcoms over the course of the decade, and that the language of this show has to be about TV. And so what we really started to really dig into was TV. Not only TV from today in HD or glorious 4K, but HD from, again, back in the 50s, where you're staring at these cathode ray tubes, and it was just kind of crazy. And so what we always begin with is we try and take the words from the page and begin to turn them into very flat artwork. And we try and turn this around quickly to be able to determine whether, is this what you're thinking? Is this what we're going for? So these are some early concepts that we did for the hex. Should it actually come out? Should it have, or should it be quite flat like a TV? Like, is it an effect that's meant to look like that? These are all questions that we use art to be able to try and help define with the director and with the showrunner and with the writers. This one's in particular quite interesting because, as you can see, the other thing, or the other concept is that there is a world outside of the hex, and then there's a world inside the hex, and that these two worlds are very, very different and need to look and feel different to the audience. And the idea for us here is to try and represent that in terms of the nighttime and daytime look, as you can see here. All right, so for us, it's really important to get to work. And so once we're able to establish sort of a generalized idea of what it is that they're looking for, then we actually start thinking about, okay, well, how would we actually execute this, particularly considering there's 10 episodes that have to be produced. So there's a lot of work to do. So the first thing we did was we try and get inspired. So our first bit of inspiration was actually the HBO logo. We really liked the idea of how in old CRT TVs, when you turn them on, the TV needed time to warm up. And then when it warmed up, it would sort of open and expose itself. And we really liked that idea in terms of how it worked. So that was our first bit of inspiration, and honestly, that went all the way to the head of Marvel, Kevin Feige, who really, really liked it and really thought that, yeah, this is the idea, this is the intention for what we're trying to get to for the show. The other thing we started to take a look at was we needed to begin to start thinking about building a language for how this hex was meant to be built. And so one of the things we also started to take a look at was when TVs go on the fritz, like when they break, what are the things that you begin to see? Because those are the things that for us are the most obvious. And if we can start sort of piecing together a little bit of that, and people also recognize that type of a language. So we started to go and dig through the internet to try and find references for that. Once we liked that idea, we went on to eBay and we actually bought like a very old black and white TV. we immediately discovered that old TVs have antiquatedly old connectors. So immediately we wanted to pipe in stuff onto the TV to be able to content onto it to see how it actually looked. But we actually had a really hard time figuring that out. So we had to employ some AV engineering help to be able to connect everything up. But eventually we were able to get it on, and then we were able to basically start throwing different types of content onto the TV, start playing with the gain it up, gain it down. We would move the TV to see if we would be able to see things. Immediately, too, we're dealing, particularly at Rodeo, we've got a lot of people that have never seen a TV like this before. They don't understand why the edges are fringed. There's sort of a fringing along the edges. There's this sort of roundness. There's a vignetting across everything. The brightness of a CRT TV is really bright in the middle, but then the brightness sort of fades off, and you've got a heavy glass that helps to distort things. These are all things that we paid attention to because these are all pieces of the language that we knew we wanted to add in. We had a happy accident that somebody dropped one of our LED TVs, and we started to see how it broke. And when we plugged it in, we were able to see not only how it broke, but we were able to see how LEDs function when they're broken. And we began to pick up on this idea as well of sort of quadrants, and that you can have hard lines, and that you can use that type of a language as well. And the last thing we did was we started to play around with magnets, because the way that a magnet interferes with TVs, both cathode ray tubes, the CRT TVs, as well as the LEDs and even the plasma TVs, we were getting really, really interesting patterns from all of this. And so for each of these things, we would basically go in, and everybody would basically come each day with a new idea, and we'd be like, that's a really good idea. And then our teams would basically go out and try and buy whatever we needed to buy to see it, and then we would basically record it for reference. And we would start to begin, and then we would give it back to the client going, well, what do you think of this? Is this the type of, does this speak to you in terms of how you would think that the hex should begin to act? The other thing we started to take a look at too was artwork. We have a lot of people that are very into art history, and so we started to take a look at artwork and how artists represent things, and to be able to sort of take ideas from art and artists, and to be able to see whether or not any of those ideas actually begin to yield some of these interesting results. So let me break down one of the shots because I'll be able to show you some of it. So this right here is the town of Westview. This is completely computer generated. This is 100% CG. That's what it looks like. We threw a sky in, fully CG town. The first thing we do is we start layering on some of the language that I was showing you before. For example, here we're beginning to see, remember when I showed you those magnets before, where we're beginning to see some of those magnetic patterns, and we layer that on top. And then we distorted a little bit in terms of the CRT TVs, where they were sort of distorted because as they get brighter at the beginning and then a little rounder at the edge, so we would distort that. Then we would add in from those LED screens that I showed you before, some of the sort of very horizontal patterns that were going into that. And then we would again fringe it so that it would actually not be, so it wouldn't look so bright, and it would actually, the brightness would fall off as you were getting towards the edge. This is what was filmed on the screen. So as you can see, the performer and nothing else. And then this is the sort of end result. And what I'm hoping you're able to see is a lot of the work and a lot of the experimentation and a lot of the building up of the language you should be able to see in this image here, from the experiments that we did on CRT TVs to LED TVs to everything. Here's the final shot. So the idea is that the effect is really meant to be very subtle. However, it should also tell you something. The language here should speak to you a little bit in saying that there's something about it being in TV, because that's the conceit of the show, is that they sort of lead you towards that. All right, so the next breakdown would be of the second shot, or sorry, the last shot I had shown you before, of her emanating from a much larger version, a much more visualized version at that point in time, because she's a little bit upset. So again, you see all of the vertical lines that we were working on before from the experimentation that we did with the LED TVs. And then we start sort of integrating her in. We start brightening everything up. We start adding chromatic aberrations. So at this point, we're adding in, sometimes we notice, particularly with the magnets, that they would sort of bring about a much richer red, green, and blue towards where the magnet is. So we'd add that in. And then we put it all together. Oops. Oh, let me go back. There we go. So that was the final shot. The whole series ends basically at the very last episode, where we begin to see how this whole thing began at the very beginning. And what's interesting is that a lot of the language that we had to build in to this show and to build into the character of the Hex ultimately gets exposed at the very end, as we begin to see not only is it a manifestation of her, but hopefully a lot of the language that you were sort of seeing, or I was able to show you in the last few slides and the breakdowns, you begin to see in terms of how the actual town itself got built and how we began this entire series to begin with. So it was a kind of a clever way to wrap it up. VFX can be tricky, particularly VFX that needs to be it actually needs to be exposed. Like, we're not trying to hide it from you. We're not trying to be completely invisible. We actually need you to be able to pay attention to it, but it also needs to feel like it sits in the environment correctly. Like, you're not taken away from it by the VFX. And to be honest with you, for a show like this, with all of the creative challenges, we actually ended up being very successful at it, which we were quite happy about. And we were happy to get the recognition as well for how tricky it was. And on top of all of that, this particular show happened to be the very first one that Marvel put out on the Disney Plus network. So there was really just a high expectation for this show, and given the high concept that it had, it just needed to work, and the reception to it was fabulous, and we were really excited to play a part of it. Here's all of our work in it, because obviously we did more than just that.
Careful, Rambo.
You're definitely not my friend.
that's WandaVision. Obviously, we worked on a lot of it, and it was a really fun project to work on. I could probably talk about it for hours or talk about any of the other Marvel projects that we worked on. We're very fortunate that this project actually happened to finish filming right before the pandemic hit. So we actually, the filming was all done, so we were able to take our time and make it great. I could talk more, but I think maybe that's probably it for me. So thank you very much. I hope that was somewhat informative about the creative process that we used to make WandaVision.
So much. Do you have time to stay for questions from the audience?
No problem.
Awesome. That was incredible. That was incredible. So fill up the Slido, people. I know there are already questions from the chat, but right off the top, I just wanted to say congratulations to everybody at Rodeo for your huge Emmy nods. That's incredible, especially in a pandemic year. So huge round of applause. This is like so exciting for you.
Thank you.
That must have felt so gratifying after a tough year to sort of get all of these, all of the recognition.
It's been for our team and our artists who put a lot of time into everything. It was very gratifying, and for a year that we had to pivot very quickly, as did everybody else, it was incredibly. It was a huge honor for us to get 3 Emmy nominations, and to be honest with you, all the work that we did, we really enjoyed. So
good. Okay, I'll ask you more about your workflow in a minute, and I'll get to some of these questions. We have a question here talking about sort of how long it took you after shooting to actually produce all of these VFX, just to give a sense of timeline, like how much work and time did it take to deliver on that after shooting?
It's a good question. I'd say we began the conversation with the team back in early 2019.
Okay.
And so we were flying back and forth between Atlanta, which is where they were shooting the series, and going back to Montreal. And we started to really begin to try and think about how we were going to execute it. Then they started filming it, and that took a while. So all said and done, probably a little bit under 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. You know, what struck me when you were giving your presentation is that you really studied all of these eras of storytelling throughout the ages, and I'm curious if you yourself found a through line or you have any insights about what makes amazing television that you can share with the other storytellers in the room.
We found that generally speaking, the stories that work are the ones that really connect with the audience. And so we've worked on a lot of films that are very high concept, but then end up going nowhere. And then ones that are very simple and are telling a very simple story that people can kind of relate to. And people just seem to really, move towards those types of projects. So, and it's really good if you have a filmmaker who kind of knows what it is that they want. We've been in a lot of rooms often where filmmakers just aren't able to express themselves. However, that sort of ends up being the bigger challenge for us, because the idea for us is, as artists, is that we need to be able to get into the filmmaker's head and try and figure out what it is that they want. And that process is just as exciting as actually making the thing.
Okay, that's very cool.
Yeah.
Somebody is asking here about, with such a massive creation, what happens inside of that initial meeting? Like, what is the energy like when, you've got the brief from WandaVision? What's the first meeting like on your team?
Yeah, I mean, the first meeting is a bit, it's both exciting and terrifying at the same time. You're basically listening to somebody try and describe to you what it is that they want. You're nodding your head, thinking that you understand what it is, but knowing full well that you probably have months ahead where you're going to really go left and go right before you finally sort of figure out what it is that they actually want. And in addition to all of that, you have a studio who says, okay, cool, but you need to be done on this date. And the interesting part of visual effects or the film or TV industry is, and having worked in software, I can at least speak to that, is that there's a very hard deadline. Movie comes out, TV shows come out. It's an immovable deadline, and you need to get done in that period of time. So ultimately, you want to put the best creative product out there, but you also need to make sure that the product is actually out there. So there's really not a lot of there's not a lot of delays.
Okay.
The deadlines are very real, and the pressure is very real in that respect. However, it's artistically driven.
Right.
So you need to also give time for the artists to be able to explore and to be able to bring ideas to the table. And Marvel's very much about the best idea always wins, almost irrespective of the time or irrespective of the money. They're a studio who invites change in at the very end, and they're willing to make a change to it if it helps serve the story. And time and time again, a lot of the work that they do really does hit it.
Okay, great. I like that idea of creative constraint, but maybe it also sort of the pressure pushes some of the creativity forward a bit. We have a lot of questions here about, what is it like to work with filmmakers and these huge, huge names, HBO, Marvel. Do you have a favorite filmmaker that you have worked with? Anna is asking this question.
I see, of course. To be honest with you, not really. I mean, at this point, we do work with a lot of people, and everybody brings this different challenge. I mean, when we were working on Game of Thrones, just the excitement of being involved in a show like that was enormous. When we moved into like Stranger Things, we just, how can you not get taken away by being part of that world and helping to create it? And then in some of the films that maybe didn't do so great, like working with Luc Besson on Valerian, but taking that comic book that was something that he's been dreaming of since he was a kid and turning it into something real. Like to capture his excitement is incredible, and then to translate that to today, I mean, that was the same excitement that Denis Villeneuve brought when he started to work on, when we finished work on Blade Runner and started to help him visualize the world of the world that he imagined as a 14-year-old boy reading Dune onto the page.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just for anybody who is an artist or a person who really enjoys a good story. Those are really. Those are the moments that you really get to enjoy.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's hard to pick a favorite because you've worked with on so many amazing projects too. Yeah,
we try and diversify, but at the same time, not everything can be a winner. But what we try and do is we try and find projects that inspire us and will hopefully help to inspire our artists. And that's actually a very important idea for us, because a lot of stuff does come to us, and we really do try and find the things that we think would resonate with our artists. They're ultimately craftsmen, and to get the best out of them is when they're inspired, when they're excited about something, and I see that at the studio across sort of all areas, which is quite fun.
Okay, I have a couple questions here that are about just that, the creative side of it. One is asking, it sounds like you need to really balance creativity with project management, and especially during the pandemic. How do you manage to do this and keep that fire alive in your creative team?
Hard.
It's hard, eh?
Hard, yeah.
People management, yeah.
Oh, it's enormous. I mean, artists are very passionate people, and put them in a room together, and you get explosions of creativity and explosions of interesting behavior and emotion, all driven towards a central idea of trying to make something better. Add to that sort of a remoteness, and it definitely is difficult. It's hard to build that out, and but everybody does persevere, and we've spent like the last 2 years figuring out how how to kind of get it done. So it does exist. It does work. It just requires a bit more commitment from everybody to communicate better and to communicate more often.
Right.
Yeah.
I have another question here from someone who's curious, I guess, in the creative space. And what are the 3 skills or the top skills and attributes you look at when you're looking to hire a creative person on your team, or even a student who's coming out of school? How can they get recruited? What kind of skills or attributes make them stand out?
I think the very first question we tend to ask is, hey, so what's your favorite film or movie? What and why? I mean, the reality is, it's we that's what we do every day, and we do it for long hours a day. So if you love what you're doing, then you're very likely to do it well. So if you enjoy the content that's put out on TV, or you really enjoy a film, we know, irrespective of all of your other skills, you're gonna come to work every day excited and eager to try and help out. And for us, the challenges are enormously varied. From being incredibly creative to incredibly technical, to our accountants, to our HR people, right? To the people that are that are tying wires under desks. Like, all of these people, the one common denominator that we try and have in our studio is all these people are really interested in the product that we're creating. And we find that passion, irrespective of the department, feeds into the company in general. And that is a culture that we really focus very, very hard on.
And you know what? It translates on screen. I have to say, you can definitely tell from what's produced at the end of the day.
And what's produced at the end of the day, for the most part, is ripped out of the artist's hands, because they would just continue to work on it for months on end.
Right. Okay. Unfortunately, well, actually, we have time now. I saw for a couple more questions. This one I really like. What is the next big idea in VFX? What do you see in terms of, is there a high competition between different studios to drive R&D effectively? Like, where do you see it being pushed even further in the short term?
Well, that's a good question. There are some pretty low-hanging fruit that I'll reach out for. So the pandemic really pushed forward the concepts of virtual production, which is basically taking these large LED screens and building and helping to build, instead of a green screen, instead put the content on these LED screens and have them just sort of function as being an extension of the environment that you're in. Mandalorian does this incredibly well. There's lots of films that sort of are utilizing the skill. The conceit of all of that is that you have enough time before you go to camera to build it all.
Right.
Reality is that actually rarely the case. So you try your best to get everything onto the screen. So virtual production requires the movement of the visual effects process from being a post process to being very much a pre-process. So suddenly you've got to manage that. That is turning into a very lucrative skill to have, and they're generally speaking driven by game engines. So you also have to have a really good understanding of how game engines work, and then just the functionality of how you make these screens work, how you get everything to sort of to look as seamless as possible. That's a big technical challenge.
Okay. I have a question here that sort of relates to this. It's about the difference in your work during production and filming and in post-production. Like, talk a little bit about what the different maybe management challenges are, or what the different or exciting opportunities are, or is there a part that you prefer to work on? It's just...
When you read the words on the page, it's really interesting, right? So in your head, you begin to start piecing together what it is that you want. Then you get into the world of drawing it out. And in some cases, if you're going to film on location, maybe you go to Google Earth and you're able to sort of figure out the actual location and then maybe draw into it to figure out what that set would look like. And And then on the day of shooting, there's a sandstorm.
Right.
There's, there's a prosthetic that somebody was meant to wear that he decided he doesn't like, the actor decided he doesn't like, and so he's not going to wear it. And so the function of what you actually film on the day and what you're preparing to film a few weeks or months before versus what was written on the page can really be vastly different.
Okay.
And the job of the VFX supervisor is to basically be nimble enough to be able to go, okay, got it. We'll pivot. We'll figure out some other means. We were working on Jungle Cruise, and we needed to get a ton of footage, which we sent. We had a drone in Montana, and it was shooting beautiful images of Montana lakes and waterfalls, and we were like, this is going to be perfect for us. We'll be able to just use that. And then suddenly, we lost connection to the drone. And then suddenly we watched the drone just go straight down, hit the river, and go over the waterfall, and we lost everything.
Oh, no.
And of course, that ended up turning into, okay, so now we have to completely do it in CG. It's okay, these are the things that sort of happen, and these are the challenges that we get, but over the course of, from a script to when you finally, when the director's finally cut what he wants, and then you have to add everything at the end, it can be so different.
Yeah.
And the work that you expected at the beginning tends to grow a lot larger, and the ambition of the director is still something that you're trying to hit.
Yeah.
But of course, the longer that they take, let's say, to cut it, the shorter you have to make it.
Yeah.
So then you move into the world of being working creatively to try and figure out a means of being able to do that. That requires a lot of project management and client management.
Yeah.
And a high technical skill set in terms of we might not even be able to get this done, so we might need to use the cloud, for example,
right,
to burst into to be able to actually get everything done. It's a when I say it's a very varied skill set across the visual effects studio, it really is.
Yeah, it sounds complex.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I don't know if you want to say just a final word about what's next for Rodeo, or what you have coming, or where people can follow you, find you. I'm rolling out the red carpet for you as an outro.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, we're rodeofx.com is the website, and what are we working on now? We're in the middle of the next season of Stranger Things. We're working on Lord of the Rings, the TV series.
Yes.
We're about to start in on Mission Impossible 7. We're wrapping up Fantastic Beasts 3.
Oh my gosh.
We just finished Foundation series, and we're just about to start in on, they just greenlit Dune 2. So that'll probably be starting up at some point soon too. So just fun challenges all around.
I cannot wait to watch it all. Thank you so much, Jordan, for coming to Campus Party Canada. It's been so delightful to talk to you. Let's get a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.